what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about some of the guys that maybe made the list that we haven't fully touched on. But as always, Shawn, it's an exciting time of the season when we get to this point. But congratulations on another fantastic piece. And when you read through the hits over the last couple of years in terms of how it has done, 2015, Devontae Freeman was the running back #1 overall. We had 2016 with Melvin Gordon. Who knows, maybe he sneaks back around again into it this year. And then we have Kareem Hunt, Alvin Kamara in 2017, James White, Tariq Cohen, Chris Carson 2018, Austin Eckler, Miles Sanders 2019, James Robinson, Antonio Gibson 2020. Last year had James Conner, who was a massive, massive success. And then down the stretch, Devin Singletary and Rashad Penny were the league-winning running backs that you had to have. So we're going to dive into it today, Shawn, but once again, awesome work on the zero RB list.
Well, thank you. Mostly it's just about the players, right? I mean, the players are the ones who really put this together by all of their amazing work through college and then battling to get into these situations on the teams. We don't want to go too much into zero RB itself for this show. I mean, that's not what this specific show is about. But when you go back and look through the successes on the list, it really reinforces how the overall process works, right? And one of the things that you have at the running back position is that it's difficult to play two stars. And so if you have this backup with elite talent, often they're not going to play much at all early. As a result, they don't get drafted that early. That is a dynamic we're seeing change a little bit this season. And you look at the prices on some guys like A.J. Dillon and Pollard, and you think to yourself, in years past, you'd be able to easily draft these players as zero RB candidates. In this season, I really feel like they are priced out. And so some of the best contingency-based plays are going as though that possibility exists. That's not something that I'm chasing necessarily. I think we have to focus on the other options, but I'm also not saying that won't work, because one of the things that we do see throughout history is that these guys come through, and when they come through, they score a lot of points. And it's shocking just how high in the overall finishes some of these running backs end up. But it's also an element where the points that they score are often so concentrated during the times of the season that are most important to us that, I mean, your upside on a zero RB team. And then one of the things that we also mention is that this list isn't just for this very select group of drafters. It's great for you if you're doing anchor RB. Even if you have a hyper fragile team and you're just going to select maybe 1-2 running backs late, you still want those guys to put up points, right? If you draft a hyper fragile team and one of your running backs early gets hit, then you're down to 2 and you're thinking, I mean, I need points from those other players, especially in best ball where you can't swap them out. But even in redraft and FFPC main events, you need to have a little bit of redundancy. And so making sure we maximize our chances at the really big play is a key part to winning in fantasy. It's one of the reasons why structure matters, but then structure within the context of we also need to be drafting the right types of players. And one of the things that was kind of fun this year, it doesn't always work out this way. I'm not trying to force this necessarily, but I do kind of run the countdown in reverse order of ADP. And so we work back from the very cheapest to the guys who are starting to get up to the edge of the dead zone there. And this season it was fun because the 15 to 11 had this theme of extreme athletes with also very inexpensively priced receptions. The 10 through 6 list was very heavy on pure breakout candidates. Always a fun group to be looking at there. And then the 5 through 1, we're getting some of these same guys back who've already done it for us, right? So we have some veteran, I wouldn't say superstar. You know me, Colm. I'm not someone who necessarily avoids hyperbole. I think it can be fun to, just be enthusiastic. So but superstars would be a stretch. But veteran,
superstar zero RB guys.
Yeah, I mean elite, borderline elite players who are still very inexpensive, right? And so those 3 groups. Today we're going to talk about one player from each, and one of the things I like about zero RB is that you can put some different profiles onto your team and they can do different things for you throughout the course of the season. You have some different ways to get it done. that's another little thing that I like in terms of how some of the tactics can get you through to where you need to be.
Yeah, and I think the first guy we're going to talk about today, so we are going to take one from each of the three pieces. The articles themselves will be linked in today's show notes, so you can check them out up on rotoviz.com. Quick plug, if you are signing up to rotoviz.com, you're not already a member, you can use the promo code RVRadio2021 at checkout to get yourself a 10% discount to gain access to all of our content and tools. But Shawn, the first guy on the list, an interesting backfield. The talk all offseason has been around Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Pacheco, Ronald Jones's continued descent down draft boards and his ADP crashing. But the guy who we've been drafting quite late in a lot of these drafts throughout the offseason is Jerrick McKinnon. He's had a little bit of a tour around the NFL in recent times, but was with the Chiefs last year, had some nice games down the stretch. But you mentioned the athletic profiles of some of these guys in the 15 up to 10 range. And Jerrick McKinnon, when he is healthy, has elite athleticism.
He really does. And you set that up nicely, talking about the Chiefs backfield and how it is one of the most interesting backfields, because if anybody ever really emerged, you could have this Kareem Hunt type of season, the types of points that he was putting up before he had his problems and got released from the Chiefs.
The dream, Shawn, would have been if the Chiefs had drafted Jonathan Taylor.
Yeah, that's not a bad dream. If they had drafted DeAndre Swift, there were some routes to getting there. But Clyde Edwards-Helaire has continued to look very pedestrian in his limited number of preseason carries. Again, we don't want to overemphasize those, but with CEH, you're looking for any spark, right? And we don't necessarily get that. You also don't get the impression that he's impressed that much in practice, which is one of the reasons that Isaiah Pacheco has been such a sensation now. In the last week or so, he has started to fade a little bit. Whether or not that's justified, I think, is up in the air. I've always been a little bit skeptical there because he doesn't have the production that you would really be looking for. Now we know that Rutgers was not a particularly good team. It's going to be harder to be a star at Rutgers than, say, at Alabama. You're running behind very different offensive lines. And yet a player at the level he supposedly has been in practice during training camp, you would expect him to be able to overcome the situation there at Rutgers more than he has. But you have special athleticism from him. You have special athleticism from McKinnon in the past. You have Ronald Jones, who actually was a big play threat, at least, again, in the past. The guy who has supposedly looked the best has been Pacheco, but then emerging recently is McKinnon. We talk about watching the preseason. People just want any kernel of intel that they can get from the way that these teams are playing the guys. The fact that Pacheco has fallen back into, what we might consider, it's not a timeshare. It's just like a handful of plays in which the teams are trying to kind of see what they have. In many ways, we're probably more at risk of making a judgment that puts us way off of where we need to be than actually finding some under the radar thing that then gets us onto the right player. But one of the reasons why I like McKinnon is that he finished the season out hot last year. And so you have that track record. He can score within the context of this offense, and he's the least expensive. And so those are two things that will really help you. You mentioned how athletic he is. You pull up the RotoViz Combine Explorer and you see that he had 98th percentile 40 time, 98th percentile bench press. I mean, this guy, an athletic freak. 92nd percentile 3-cone, 99th percentile broad jump, 96th percentile vertical leap. Then you think back to not that long ago when he's more or less being deactivated, sent to the sidelines because of dead legs, became a real punchline in the fantasy community. And it's important to remember that football players, especially running backs, age very, very quickly. Now, I do mention a couple other guys in these articles, or in this specific article, who are also older backs, to where the information gleaned from practice tracking will confirm that the athleticism is still there. You watch what McKinnon did in the playoffs last season, the athleticism still seems to be there. You see him catch a third down outlet pass from Patrick Mahomes. He's the guy who is intuitive in the receiving game, where the other three players really are not. He's the guy who, when he catches it out there, can get to the edge, can get around the corner, can get that first down. keeping these drives alive is the most important thing for NFL teams. You have a limited number of possessions in a football game. You saw that kill the Chiefs last year in the AFC Championship game in the second half. You have a limited number of possessions. A few punts are forced, and all of a sudden that game completely changes. So we know that McKinnon has a role that's valuable. Last season, from weeks 18 to weeks 21, scored 66 total points. Now, during that stretch, he didn't have the level of competition for touches that he'll probably have to start the season this year. But with McKinnon, you're hoping that he starts. He has a little bit of standalone value. I mean, he starts playing, not necessarily as the starter. He has a role, has a little bit of standalone value, and then as the season progresses, we don't want anybody to get hurt. It's hard for NFL football players to not. But regardless of what happens, we want him to consolidate his role in the Chiefs offense as an important piece who has, not really Danny Woodhead or Darren Sproles or like very top James White season type of upside, where those guys are actually like in that RB6, RB7 type of range. I mean, that's probably above the actual season ceiling for Jerrick McKinnon. But to get in a stretch where he has, RB12 to RB15 type of upside, and during that stretch, you can play him, so you plug him in as your RB2, I think that's very realistic.
Moving into the top 10 now, Shawn, and look, we joked last year about the king of the running back dead zone was Mike Davis, but Mike Davis did play a substantial role, particularly in the early part of the season with the Atlanta Falcons. Obviously, Cordell Patterson was the real breakout, very, very late round pick, sometimes undrafted up until the last kind of week or so of the season. He is going now, though, as the lead back in the Atlanta backfield, but they did draft Tyler Allgeier this year. He did slip to 151st in the NFL draft. May not have the athleticism that we mentioned that Jerrick McKinnon would have in terms of that five of the group, but when we look at this five, there's some interesting names in it. But Tyler Allgeier, what stood out for you to add him to the list, and particularly to get him to the top 10? Obviously, that there is obviously ranked by ADP, but he is kind of currently going in an interesting range of the draft.
Yes. So it was disappointing to see him fall, but he does go into a situation with the Atlanta Falcons that is pretty much perfect, right? You look at what he's done from a production standpoint. 2020 averages 7.5 yards per carry. 2021 jumps up to 278 attempts. He catches 28 more passes. He goes over 1,800 yards from scrimmage. He doesn't have the elite measurables, but he still earns comps like James Conner, Zach Moss, Eddie Lacy, especially Conner and Lacy. We know those guys have scored some fantasy points on occasion. And this is a player who probably outperforms the tested athleticism. His breakaway rush score of 78, you contrast that to guys like Pacheco, who we just mentioned, who is 38, Tyrion Davis-Price 34, Brian Robinson 33, Dameon Pierce 23. This is the guy who was able to break some big plays at BYU. He looks very impressive from a size, athleticism standpoint when you're watching him play, even just in these preseason games. We know he's gotten a little bit trendier now after scoring 2 touchdowns in preseason week 3. That's really one of the reasons that we do like him. He has this potential to be a goal line threat for them. You mentioned Mike Davis, disappointed last season, but even within the context of disappointing, he still finished at 9.5 expected points per game. That's a range where someone is playable, especially if you think that they have individual touchdown upside in any particular game when you throw them out there. But the real thing is that they probably wanted Davis to be above that 9.5, right? In the first 5 games of the season, he was at 15 and then sort of played himself out of the role. We could see the opposite with Allgeier, where he starts at kind of the lower level that Mike Davis was at in the second half of last season, really the second fiddle to Cordell Patterson. But then as the season progresses, we know this Falcons team is still very much in the building process. They're in the talent acquisition phase. They probably don't want to overexpose Cordell Patterson. Allgeier could be that 15 EP game guy down the stretch, and that's exactly when you need him for fantasy.
Shawn, as we move into that top 5, obviously the top 5 is what people probably are messaging the most about. Who's going to be Shawn's top 5 guys this year? How does it play out? But the key is that then when we do these drafts, because they're based on ADP, the top 5 maybe aren't essentially able to be on the one roster because they're going to go in similar ranges in terms of ADP. Usually, if you can get 2 of these guys in dream scenarios, you might get 3 of them. But a lot of the time, what you're doing is the 15. And I even sent Shawn a screenshot of a draft I did after it came out, and I had 5 of the top 15. That's probably what you're hoping to get in terms of that overall build. But Shawn, this one here, a few interesting names in it. We won't go through them all, but the one I did want to bring up, because I even had somebody who did a draft recently, and they sent me the draft, and they were like, oh, I took, and it's going to be this guy's name. And then I was like, well, surprise for you, he's on the 0 RB list. So we have talked quite a bit about his running mate, and that is Ramondre Stevenson being the other side of this coin. But Damien Harris makes the list at number 3. Obviously, we have Ramondre Stevenson, a superb talent, looked really strong at points last year, but Damien Harris also had a monster season. He had 15 total touchdowns on the season last year, and this is a similar situation, Shawn, to last year, maybe with Zach Moss, Devin Singletary. Both of those guys were going in a similar range. The ADP started to change, and then now in this situation, Harris is the least expensive of the two. So obviously it's hard to bet against Ramondre Stevenson, but it's also hard to get a bet against Damien Harris and his talent of what he showed last year. How are you breaking down that Patriots backfield, and what's your thoughts on Harris as he is number 3 on the list?
The Patriots are always going to be a controversial one. We know their backs have been tricky to play in recent seasons, but the overall size of the pie can help. Last year, their backs scored the second most total points in fantasy. So even once you split that up, you still have some scoring. That's one of the reasons why Damien Harris ended up being a pretty good pick for people last season. I included him on the list as a little bit of a contrarian play and to force myself to make sure I didn't get too lazy or content in terms of the types of players that I'm drafting. The preference would be to take someone like Ramondre Stevenson, where you're looking at him and thinking, okay, this guy could be David Johnson. This guy could be Le'Veon Bell. If Damien Harris gets hurt or gets traded, the traded part seems far less likely now, since Ty Montgomery might not be healthy at the beginning of the season. There are backups behind that, maybe not playing quite to the level that they would be comfortable with getting rid of him. But Ramondre Stevenson, very easy to see how he could finish as a top 5 overall back, certainly a top 5 back, say, over the second half of the season. 230 pounds. He's number 2 in the NFL last year with a 14.3% broken tackle rate. You look at Harris, and the numbers aren't as gaudy, but they're still impressive, right? We're talking about a player who was an elite goal line back last year. His numbers, and you can pull this up and get in the really cool stealing signals tool. Looking at those numbers inside the 5, very similar to James Conner, Austin Eckler. Those backs, much more expensive. Now, those backs also have some other things in their profile, potentially elite receiving backs as well. But I don't think that Harris is that similar to LeGarrette Blount, who had 13 touchdowns on 29 in close attempts in 2016. But again, one of the things that it reinforces that this Patriots offense can potentially do that. Damien Harris, a better talent, I think that people realize. He's probably one of the best pre-contact runners in football. He joins Darrell Henderson, Jonathan Taylor, Miles Sanders, kind of in that group, averaged 2.5 yards before contact in 2020, up to 2.1 last year. The thing that really separates him from Henderson and Sanders is he balances that pre-contact ability with post-contact toughness. Obviously not a small back. Averaged 2.6 after contact in 2020, 2.4 last year. As a result, his yardage efficiency ends up being fantastic, right? Now, the question I think that everybody has, and then I get asked a lot, is what about now? Because Josh McDaniels is gone. They're trying to change the offense to more of a Shanahan type of offense. They appear to have non-offensive coaches in charge of some of these things. That part, maybe not the best. And I think that the upside eventually will get to be better. Bill Belichick has talked about how now within this new offense, they may use these guys more for a 3-down workload. If you take out the 4.7 receiving EP that Brandon Bolden averaged last year, and obviously James White played for a couple games, he was over 6. JJ Taylor pulled out a little bit as well. Maybe they won't have as much receiving upside within the context of this new offense, but If you add a little bit to Harris, if you add a little bit to Stevenson, if they're both playing 3 downs on some of their drives, you can see how that is going to add to the receiving numbers. It also creates a dynamic where if Stevenson is the one who misses some time, then Harris has immense upside in that stretch. And now that we've moved into this context where he's like 3 rounds less expensive, you have to consider betting on him. One of the things that we don't like to do is bet on the guy who simply has the week 1 workload. If that player is in round 5 and the backup who actually has a better chance of getting the full workload is in round 13, I mean, that's a no-brainer. It gets more difficult once you switch it to where the backup is actually more expensive. Now, this may be a case of 1A, 1B. It may be a case where Stevenson is the 1A, but he's going ahead of Brandon Ayuk, ahead of Devontae Smith. That is tricky from a overall structure perspective. You probably don't want to let yourself in too many drafts get kind of caught by the wide receiver avalanche. Maybe if you're not concerned about that, you still feather in a little bit of Stevenson. But if you're worried too that the Patriots are going to be bad this year or they're going to get off to a slow start, then that probably hits the more expensive player more, because you need the early production and you need the elite production, the ceiling production from that player more than you need the guy who's being drafted 2 or 3 rounds later. And again, the 2 or 3 rounds may not be the big deal. It's the tier break that's the big deal. And I do think that they're on 2 different sides of a pretty significant tier break in 2022. All of those things lead me to believe that if there is upside, the best way to get access to it is probably through a player who is more talented than at least I've been giving him credit for. Maybe in general, the fantasy community is higher on him, but more talented than I've given him credit for, and has this potential now to move into a profile that's very good for fantasy scoring. You know, one of the things I mentioned recently in discussing this with a number of other very sharp drafters is just this idea that the Patriots are probably a little bit different than, 28, 29 other teams. When you think about the Kansas City Chiefs, for example, I don't think that they were necessarily upset with their offensive coordinator last year, but you did have some rumors that maybe they wanted him to get a head coaching job because their other option was to fire him. They bring back the failed head coach from the Chicago Bears. I mean, you've got some guys on the Kansas City Chiefs staff that maybe there are some question marks about, yet no one's concerned about Kansas City. Now, you can say that's because of Patrick Mahomes. That's very different than having Mac Jones and what he can cover up. But on the one side, you have Andy Reid. On the other, you have Bill Belichick. This Patriots team is a unit that I believe during one of their Super Bowl runs, they lost in week 1 or week 2 to the Buffalo Bills, like a bazillion to 0 or -30 or something. Was that the exact score, Colm?
I don't know the exact score, but I think you're thinking of the we're on to Cincinnati season where they got blown out in week 1 and then they decided to go and run the league, basically.
So, yeah, I mean, is it a good thing that the Patriots have struggled with their offense in the preseason and have very odd coaches in charge of it? No, I mean, that worries me like it worries everybody. But one of the things that you can potentially put together just these power complete, league crushing teams because of is when you look at situations where the pricing is wrong because everybody is concerned about the same thing or concerned about something that is valid but could flip. And, no, we don't want to go out there and just chase points off of all of the bad teams. One of the running jokes you and I have had, Colm, is that our best ball teams are really heavily playing the week 17 Seahawks-Jets matchup. If you have some Seahawks and Jets on your team, you probably want to have some good players or some players on good teams for the rest of the team. But when you have elite talents and you have situations where the offense is expected to be bad, so much of the downside is baked into the price, whereas the upside you're getting for free. I'm not suggesting you're getting Harris upside for free. He still goes in a range where there are plenty of other good players. You want to be careful about what you're doing there. Get some exposure to more than the one guy. But I've come around on his talent, and I think that 6 weeks from now or 8 weeks from now, we're all likely to be looking at this Patriots offense in a very different light.
Yeah, I think so. And you made a very good point there, talking about the price differences and the fact that there's a lot of times we'll talk on the show about players that we don't draft because the players that are going in the same range are too valuable to pass up on. You mentioned Brandon Ayuk and Devontae Smith. They're going in the range now where Stevenson's going, which makes that a challenging pick. But then once you go past that, there is a tier break, and it makes it very interesting then for Harris. Obviously, we'll have some updates to the zero RB list over the next couple of weeks before the season kicks off here. But yeah, definitely you need to be reading it up on rotoviz.com.